Right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending another one of these Friday webinars and spending a little bit of your time on this Friday afternoon. I am Henry Chong, CEO of FUSANG, and I have with me Hin from FUSANG as well. Say hi, Hin.
Hi, I'm Hin Liu. I'm a lecturer of law at the University of Oxford. I'm also a business and legal associate at FUSANG.
Brilliant. And I have with me today Urszula McCormack, partner at King Wood and leading legal light in the digital asset space. And so we're very delighted to have her here to talk to us today. But maybe I'll let you just briefly introduce yourself, Urszula.
Thanks so much, Henry. Thanks so much for having me today. So my name is Urszula McCormack, and I'm a partner of King Wood Mallesons, and I'm the global fintech sector lead for our firm based and very much focused on Asia and the Pacific region.
Yes, and of course, as I said, I'm Henry Chong of FUSANG. I'm pretty sure most of you know me. And as a reminder, in case you stumbled upon this webinar by accident, FUSANG builds end-to-end digital infrastructure for digital assets so that we can enable both individuals and institutions to access this market in a way that is safe, convenient, and compliant, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Our topic is, in essence, who actually owns the assets that sit within a custodian. With traditional assets, these are things that people don't really even think about. You'll call your local broker and you'll say, I want to buy some Apple stock, and then some magic will happen. And you trust that your stock is being stored somewhere safe, you hope. But you don't really think too much about it. With digital assets, with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, obviously this is foremost in a lot of investors' minds, especially institutions. Because if you have heard about Bitcoin, you probably also heard a lot of noise about hacks and about your assets being stolen. And so one of the first questions I always get about digital assets, whether things like Bitcoin or the kind of digital shares that FUSANG is most interested in, the first questions I always get are, hey, is this safe? Is someone going to steal it? How do I know where these things are exactly? And just as with the traditional asset world, these things will end up being stored by custodians, people whose job it is to not only keep those assets safe, but to do a whole coterie of jobs around servicing that assets. And what I guess we'd like to begin here today is just to briefly talk about a paper that me and Hin have co-authored with Louise Gullifer, who I think is on this call as well, actually, and to talk a bit about some of the conclusions of our paper, where we look at different legal relationships for digital asset custodians. We're not going to talk about technology operations today, but just talking about when you deposit, let's say, one Bitcoin with your custodian, on what basis is that custodian holding it for you? We'll run through that real fast, maybe about 5 minutes, and then we can just have a chat, and we'd love to hear what Urszula has to say about all of this. But Hin, why don't you take us through maybe the 4 kinds of legal relationships to begin with?
Sure. So in essence, there are 4 ways in which an investor can deposit cryptocurrency or crypto assets at an exchange. And there are 4 types of legal relationship that can exist between the two. So the first type of legal relationship is an outright title transfer. That means that I transfer, as an investor, a Bitcoin or crypto security straight to the exchange. The exchange owns the asset outright. That means it's his. It's free for it to dispose of the asset. It can do anything with the asset. Its creditors can come after the asset. The taxman can come after the asset. So this is absolute dominion over the asset. And that's contrasted with the second type of legal relationship, which is the trust. And a trust is where an asset is held on behalf of another. So in this case, the exchange with the custodian holds the asset on behalf of the investor. So if the exchange goes bust, the investor gets the asset back. And in terms of tax treatment, it tends to be the investor that gets taxed, because it's beneficial interest that gets taxed. And the third type of legal relationship is something we call a quasi-bailment. And this is essentially bailment with a caveat. Bailment is a relationship where an asset that I legally and beneficially own is in the possession of another person. And that person agrees to hold it on behalf of the person who owns it. And that's a traditional bailment. But the concept of bailment under English law and Hong Kong law only extends to tangible assets. So like a cup or a phone. It doesn't extend to a crypto asset, because a crypto asset is, by definition, intangible. So instead of it being a bailment, which gives rise to a duty of care, we say it's a quasi-bailment, because a crypto asset can be the subject of exclusive control by the intermediary or custodian. And if that's the case, we can say that there is a quasi-bailment, meaning that the principles related to bailment, generating a duty of care, can extend by analogy to a crypto asset. And so that's the quasi-bailment. It's the third type of legal relationship. The fourth type of legal relationship is the mere contractual obligation, meaning that all the obligations between the investor and the intermediary sound in contract. So this would be the case where, say, there's a software contract, or that there's a technology provider such as Amazon Web Services, and all the relationships that exist between the investor and the intermediary sound within that contract. So there's no property consequence to that, unlike the previous three types of relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I maybe just to reframe some of those in layman terms, as the only non-lawyer in the room, you know, to me, an outright title transfer is just, I give you this asset, it's now your asset. Not many people realize this is what happens when you deposit money at a bank. You know, the bank just gives you an IOU back, in effect. And of course, you have, you know, sort of a contractual arrangement where I give you the asset and you have this piece of paper that has certain contractual terms, and that is whatever it is. But both of those, you know, probably not what people imagine when they think of custody. They think of, I'm giving you the asset. It's still my asset. They're just supposed to be looking after it for me. And then I guess you have bailment and trust. But without getting into the details, you know, I think the natural conclusion, at least in common law jurisdictions like Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, the UK, is going to be a trust, purely because the concept of a bailment is just, you know, less enshrined, you know, less thought out over these many centuries, and not least of which, because obviously bailments really traditionally shouldn't be for intangible assets.
And this stands in contrast with the trust, which is the concept that's been developed over the centuries. So we know the outer boundaries of the concept of the trust. So what can a trustee do? What terms can be put into the trust? Can the trustee have a right of use? All these things are relatively settled under the common law, whereas the outer boundaries of the concept of bailment are far from settled, because, well, not least because the concept of bailment doesn't apply to tangibles.
Yes.
And that's why we have to construct this analogous concept called quasi-bailment.
Yes, absolutely, which I don't like. But well, maybe if I could put this question to you, Urszula. So if it seems like not only is trust the natural conclusion for digital asset custodian, but quite frankly, the way in which many traditional assets are being held already anyway, you would think, well, what's the big deal, right? Well, if I'm a digital asset custodian, I raise my hand and say, okay, fine, I'm trustee. Everything is very clean and clear, and off we go. And yet, when I look around at the digital asset industry, I don't see that very often. And in fact, all of the court cases that seem to crop up around custodians are all them trying very hard to say, no, we're not trustees. Why do you think that is, Urszula?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. So, you know, I think that, you know, when we look at the types of custody that are out there, you know, the first question is, you know, what's the purpose of anybody holding those assets? And it's not always just to be held and protected. So increasingly, that is becoming a big market, trust as a service, custody as a service, you know, recognizing that more and more that large institutions certainly don't want to be holding, you know, those large assets necessarily themselves, but may want to entrust it to a specialized provider like they do their securities and their cash, unless they've got the in-house capability. So it is possible that they do want that service, and we are seeing it, you know, really strong growth in that zone, and then all of those, you know, wonderful trust arrangements and protections can kick in. But the reality is that, you know, really up until this point and continuing, you know, people hand over their assets for various purposes, and that is to trade, for example, or simply to, you know, have them move, you know, from A to B, or perhaps to be held, you know, pending something else going on, or even, for example, for some sort of staking arrangement, and that's certainly something that's very, very popular in the DeFi world. But that arena is where there's, you know, just massive, you know, difference, and generally you don't see the sort of trust arrangements at all. Also,
arrangements in some cases.
Yeah, well, absolutely, you know, and you know, and there can be good reason for that, because it may well be, you know, payment for another product, right? You know, and so there is no need for a trust arrangement because there is a proper transfer. I mean, the other component to it is that many sort of services providers want to use the asset. That is how banks operate. They don't sit there on top of the cash; they're deploying it, they're putting it to work. That's how they can pay the interest rates. So, you know, that's also why we now have a depositor protection regime. Why, you know, we also have controls to stop runs on banks. You know, it's the way that the economy works. So, you know, that whole question of why is the asset being moved is very important, but also what does the person holding it want to do with it?
Yes, absolutely. And as I said, it always seems like when something goes wrong and the custodian goes bankrupt, that's when they all try very hard to say that we're not a trustee and actually these assets belong to us. Well, maybe to talk a bit about that, insolvency, right? Or when things go wrong, that's always when people actually unpick these arrangements. Why ask you, Hin? You've seen obviously lots of cases, things like Cryptopia. How far do you think how far do you think custodians can get with saying, no, actually, I'm not a trustee and these are my assets all along?
So all this depends upon the agreement itself. So each agreement between the custodian and its investor has different terms. And the question is, how far can we exclude, how far can we modify or tailor the incidents of such an agreement to our liking? So can a trustee, for example, exclude all its duties? In general, contractual autonomy is a hallowed principle of English and Hong Kong law. So that suggests that we can actually modify the incidents at our will. But then there are public policy and statutory limits to that. So most importantly, in the English context, we have the Unfair Contract Terms Act and also the Consumer Rights Act, which provides a good level of protection in relation to unfair contractual terms. But when it comes to a trust, it's quite different because as the essence of a trust is an asset held for the benefit of another, there's a core duty of good faith. You have to act in the beneficiary's interests. So that throws into the mix a very different set of considerations and raises the question of to what extent we can actually exclude these duties of good faith. So there's a case called Citibank versus MBIA. You're allowed to exclude many of the seemingly irreducible duties of good faith. But there's a limit to this. How far can we confer a right, for example, a right of use on the trustee and still maintain that there is a trust? So if a trustee holds an asset for the benefit of the beneficiary, the trustee is not expected to use the asset for its own benefit. But then
it's really the definition of a trust.
It's the definition of a trust, exactly. So how far can we qualify this proposition and say, there's still a trust? So the line seems to be drawn where you have a right of use over the asset, but something has to come back into the trust. So for example, if I enter into a repo transaction or a derivatives transaction, and I've disposed of the asset that's held on trust, there's an obligation. So there's a right that I have against the counterparty in that transaction that can be held on trust for the investor. So that is still consistent with a trust because you're still holding an asset on trust. But what if you just dispose the asset outright so that nothing is left in the trust fund? Conceptually, that can't be a trust because a trust is a right or an asset that's held on behalf of the investor. When there's no right, there's no trust. There's just a personal obligation like an IOU. What does this look like?
Yes.
Well, this is a really important topic to discuss. So, how far can you push freedom of contract within a trust arrangement? And, that really does come down to the specific, rules and expectations and precedent in a particular jurisdiction. But generally, the structures are respected unless they're really a sham. So the question is it a sham? And, if I were to think about it in terms of, the assets could well be not necessarily just, we'd say disposed of, but they're put to work or they're deployed. And as long as that is potentially for the benefit of the beneficiary, well, that still clearly remains within that. If it's not, then it starts to really test the boundaries of that trust relationship. I mean, the other thing we can talk about it either now or a bit later on is the impact of regulation on trustees and therefore what that means for that freedom of contract.
No, tell us more about that because, I've always thought that given that trust are such flexible devices, then the fact that you see so many digital asset custodians not willing to declare themselves as trustee, the logical conclusion is they want to avoid some of the regulatory consequences in some way. Tell us more a bit about that, Urszula.
Yeah, well, look, so, regulation, one of my favorite topics. So, what is the sort of realm of regulation around trustees? Well, usually and increasingly, there is regulation directly of trustees. And that is driven by a number of factors, but that includes the fact that trust and company service providers are designated in the Financial Action Task Force recommendations as being a class of services providers that ought to be regulated. But generally speaking, that regulation is really primarily targeted at AML controls and not necessarily the deeper obligations, with some exceptions. And we will see an expansion across to other types of custodians and services providers, in that regime. But the greater impact is through indirect regulation. And what I mean by that is the regulation that is imposed upon those who use the services of custodians. And that's not just in the virtual asset realm, although that's a great example where it's, really, heavily in that vein, including in, in Hong Kong. But also, you see it in things like the stored value facilities regimes for digital wallet providers. The way in which they custody fiat is highly regulated, and typically a trust arrangement is imposed in those circumstances to protect the end users. And so too, we're looking at regulations around diligence, around the technology that's used. We're looking at the sorts of obligations that are imposed in relation to the asset segregation, for example, to help protect it upon catastrophic events, either technological or corporate.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you say that a lot of the regulation of trustees and custodians often alights only on the KYC AML aspects, I don't think you should underestimate the impact of that in terms of why so many digital asset custodians want to avoid being labeled as trustee. In many jurisdictions, if you're acting as a trustee for money, right, as a business, as a repetitive business for financial consideration, that often attracts some kind of licensing requirements. And at minimum, that will imply some kind of KYC AML duties. In essence, hey, who are your customers and where is their money coming from? And while you might think that these are pretty straightforward questions for a financial institution to answer, the honest truth is that most digital asset intermediaries don't want to know, right? And the truth is they don't really know who all of their customers are, and they couldn't actually comply even with very basic KYC AML rules.
Well, and actually, this you raise a really good point, and it's true of the legal relationship. You see this time and time again, like even large custodians sometimes not being able to pinpoint whether or not they believe they've established a trust relationship or not, or the precise, where the bottom line is if there were an insolvency event. So I think that holds true across a number of these areas.
Yes, absolutely. But honestly, as I said, given that to me that, a trust is literally a device, in essence, for saying, hey, I'm going to give you this asset, right? You look after it for my benefits. And that to me sounds an awful lot like what a lot of custodians do. And my opinion is that obviously in terms of investor protection, especially in this burgeoning digital asset industry, more and more people should declare themselves as trustees and start acting accordingly. Maybe I just want to turn a bit quickly to a question from the audience asking Urszula about the right of use for a custodian. Whether it is more like repos or whether it's just outright loans. In your experience, what have you seen?
Yeah, well, look, widespread redeployment of assets, sometimes formally, in a nice, beautiful document that sets all that out, but more often than not at all. In terms of the management of assets, at exchange, we still see widespread, I can't say non-compliance because in some cases there aren't specific rules, but really not the level of governance that you would expect. And certainly, some great case studies out there where things have not borne out very well for those, who have been left hanging. The adage is, you never leave your assets on exchange. Luckily, that's changing. We're starting to see insured, regulated custodians. And do we trust the entity? Yes, but we trust the regulation behind it. We trust the insurer behind it. So, that engenders trust and it engenders, the greater use of those custodians. But yeah, look, widespread redeployment of assets.
And I would say, I see that as well. And I would say that's a big reason why people want to avoid labels in terms of legal relationship, in terms of regulation, because in many cases they use these assets willy-nilly and they don't want to have to start worrying about slightly more formal roles, including, these inconvenient questions like, hey, if it's a trust, and I'm lending something out, does something need to come back so that I can still satisfy, the four corners of the trust? If I just do it, making outright loans for which I capture the interest, that starts to seem a bit too far versus like a repo agreement where at least something goes back into the trust.
I think this is good for the long term because if there's no legal relationship, investors just want to be protected, and we have to raise awareness of the fact that, hey, not every agreement is going to leave you protected. And so the more we raise awareness of this fact, the more people would want their custodians to hold their assets on trust.
Yes.
Yeah, because who wants to keep their address on a piece of paper locked away either, right? You want to be able to help people out, improve the user experience, not make them feel like they have to withdraw, that they can actually safely have assets there ready to go if they want to trade.
Yes, absolutely. You know, that's what I've always said, that, you know, the nice thing about digital assets, whether again, pure cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or digital securities that obviously Fusang is interested in, is the fact that you can transfer these things much more freely. But that said, the vast majority of people still are going to want to hold their assets with an intermediary. Just like how today you have cash. Cash in theory is decentralized. I can pull money out of my wallet and give it to you, Hin, right now without needing anyone else. But the truth is, most of us keep most of our money in banks, not under our mattress. In fact, most of us find the idea laughable, right? When a friend says, no, I keep all my money under my mattress, you think he's a little bit crazy and irresponsible. And I think that it's the duty of digital asset custodians to evolve to such a point where it becomes the same way. They say, hey, you could do this yourself, but come on, right? It's just better and safer to keep it with a trustee.
It also provides an incentive for the custodians themselves to hold assets on trusts, because if the investors are aware of the fact that some arrangements wouldn't leave them protected, they would want to trust.
Yes.
And so custodians would also want to signal their legitimacy to clients by holding the asset on trust. So it's a positive feedback loop that we have to create.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, that leads, I think, very well into another question we have here, which is about the chain of custody. And obviously with traditional assets, especially securities, you have layers and layers of intermediated custodians. And, you know, the question, I guess, is whether or not they're, you know, perhaps the same thing would happen for digital assets and whether there are similar implications for investors. As regards to the legal relationship, I suppose. And I would say, well, that's exactly why you need a legal relationship like a trust arrangement. So you can trace that chain versus if you gifted your asset to someone, that probably breaks the chain. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, brilliant. And maybe I'll let you answer this question, Urszula, about airdrops and forks, I see.
This is a good one. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
so let's say, and then maybe just briefly for the benefit of the larger audience here, you know, a lot of blockchain-based assets, you can fork blockchains. So I can basically take the core code, copy it, make a few changes, and have a different branch of this, so to speak. In which case, if there is a token associated with this blockchain, I suddenly have 2 tokens instead of 1. And I guess the question is, can a trustee benefit from airdrops? I guess one scenario to imagine is if there's a fork and the trustee decides that they do not want to support, or the custodian decides they don't want to support that fork, for example, what happens to that asset? Are there any duties involved? What do you think about that, Urszula?
Yeah, look, such a good question. You know, we're speaking about a scenario that could be quite significant, right? You know, so you know, Ethereum forked, and we had Ethereum Classic, and you know, the one that we see most, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, both valuable assets, right? So this can have quite significant financial implications. So you know, the starting point is if it's on trust, trustee cannot profit, right? And you know, also has a duty to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries. And so the question is, again, you know, so I guess if I were at the start of the drafting process for a lovely trust document, of course, I'd like work in specific contractual provisions that make really clear what the obligations are. You know, is it possible for me to retain? You know, or what do I do if I can't support it technologically? Even without that, if let's say I got old school trustee and nothing about that, is there scope to argue that, look, you know, there's just no way I can support this technologically? Yes, there is. You know, so there of course would be a pragmatic way through a scenario where it's just not feasible. You know, or perhaps the trust assets aren't sufficient to warrant the cost that would be involved to take advantage of that fork or that airdrop, right? So, you know, there's still scope about it, but you know, this is increasingly part of the agreements that we're drafting, loans, security, you know, trust arrangements, contemplating this scenario because it happens all the time. Airdrops also, you know, go into particular addresses, and it does get a little bit more complicated, or when you've got the sort of lending and security arrangements. How do you calculate interest? Should it be on just the asset loaned, or should it be something else? So certainly something to contemplate specifically, because these things happen all the time.
Yes,
also, a more practical point in relation to the asset that's being held on trust. So if there is a fork and that creates 2 different sets of assets, what asset do the trustees' duty relate to? Because if it's to the old asset, it might have diminished. Is it allowed to go with the second fork instead of the first fork, the second version of the blockchain, or is it obliged to hold the new asset and the old asset on trust for the beneficiary? Can it make decisions? Does it have the authority to choose between the versions?
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
raises a series of very difficult questions.
Absolutely. And I mean, the scenario I can imagine is where, let's say a trustee is holding something like Ethereum and someone forks it and the trustee decides, well, yeah, it's too much trouble, I'm not going to support that. And later on, that asset becomes worth an awful lot of money. And then the beneficiaries come up to the trustee and say, oi, where's my stuff? And obviously, complicated questions.
Yeah. Well, look, and the upside again, then I guess of a trust arrangement is at least you've got a shoe in. If you don't, typically exchanges will be very upfront that you won't get the benefit of, forking or sort of any other network event, and you need to withdraw them before that occurs. So that is there. But yes, you can imagine that you'll fight over it, particularly if you're selecting a controversial side of the chain.
No,
and one would imagine that all trust deeds in the crypto asset context would include the broadest possible exclusion of the duty of care. Because if one's careless in choosing the wrong chain, the chain discarded ends up profiting by
yes, no,
tenfold, profiting tenfold.
Absolutely. Well, time is
yeah. I mean, discretion. Just there really needs to be built in some discretion acting reasonably. I mean, that's the crux, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think general trust law principles allow for that to happen.
Yes. Absolutely. And that's something that I've always admired about English common law, the flexibility to evolve and are created. And, I hear, honestly, a lot of people complaining all the time in our industry where they say, oh, the law is uncertain, or regulation's uncertain, or we can't do this or that. We don't know how. And I'm like, figure it out.
It's the best we can do. The best we can do there.
And the law, I would argue, is actually surprisingly flexible. And really, I have always believed up to operators like ourselves to figure out an operational path forward. Well, time is flying swiftly on. So maybe just one last question for you, Urszula. What would you say is the most important thing that an end investor should contemplate when picking a digital asset custodian?
So a few things. I would say that the three key things would be their regulatory status. It is such an important backstop. There are things that regulators can do, primarily because they hold the license over the custodian that cannot be achieved or are much slower to achieve via sort of court action directly. So it's incredibly powerful to have a regulator that is in the picture. And if there's no regulator and someone's professing to be a custodian, then you've got some trouble there anyway. The second is technological savviness, awareness. There just really isn't any substitute for a custodian understanding how to actually hold those assets, and it seems so obvious, but for those of us who've been in this for a while, but selection of technologies, being able to be on top of the emerging threats that may challenge some of these technologies, because some of them are still new, right? So that sort of robust approach. And then thirdly, of course, the way in which they're going to be held. So being really clear about what the use rights are of the trustee, what the obligations are, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, as a follow-on to that, do you think, therefore, that digital asset custodians should be explicitly regulated? Because in many countries, it's kind of opt-in, I would say, right? That there isn't always explicit regulations around custodians, including Hong Kong. Do you think that should be legislated on?
Yeah, Hong Kong has regulates just the trust providers. Should it be broader? Yes, and that will come with the fact that FATF does require the regulation of all virtual asset services providers, so that'll come. But what we need is not just the AML requirements, but we need the prudential obligations that extend to the holding assets. We need to see more from regulators around the specific controls that are expected, which can start on a principles basis. It always is the best place to start, and then become more specific. We are already seeing some more specific rules coming into play. Bermuda is one that has a code of practice that is quite detailed, and there are a number of others. Those codes are developed in partnership with industry, which is why they are so good. And I think that just over time increasing the granularity, but of course looking at the areas of greatest risk. So of course there should be a starting point around public funds, for example, and how custodians are regulated for those, and then moving through. But absolutely should benefit from specific targeted regulation.
Absolutely, especially if, I guess, FUSANG achieves our mission of trying to bring more and more securities into digital format. We obviously hope that the kinds of assets and the value of assets we'll see in the space will expand greatly. So I completely agree. I think these questions will be more and more pertinent. Anyway, we've actually run a little over our scheduled time. So, you know, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out and spending your time on a Friday afternoon. And thank you very much to Urszula for your insights. We actually have worked together on a number of projects, including FUSANG itself. So thank you for all of your efforts over time. Brilliant. Well, thank you, everybody. And
thank you.
If you have questions for
Great
any
to chat.
for me, or especially for Urszula,
Anytime.
feel free to reach out to us and we'll make sure these get to the right people. And if not, I think we've got a whole bunch of upcoming webinars hosted by FUSANG. We've got one upcoming from the Bitcoin Association next Tuesday, I believe, which will be fascinating, I think, and plenty more to come. And you can just look for all of those at www.fusang.co/webinars. And otherwise, have a great weekend, everybody, and talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye, everybody.